It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson.
Hello everyone to another episode of Pure Performance. I'm still in South Africa, and believe it or not, I'm currently standing in a wine cellar surrounded by many different barrels. The place here is called the Rickety Bridge, and with me I have Kelvin Klein. Kelvin.
Hey Andy, how you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for, first of all, an amazing week in South Africa. We did events this week in Johannesburg and then in Cape Town, and then you were nice enough to extend the stay and actually bring me up here to, what's the place called again?
So we're in the Franschhoek region in the Western Cape, in Cape Town, which is really well known for the wine that South Africa provides to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And then, so today we are actually on a so-called wine train tour, right?
Yeah.
And it's like different train tracks, and they bring you from estate to estate, and you can just explore wine and taste everywhere. Yeah.
100%. And I think the one we're in now is called Rickety Bridge, which is a really well-known wine estate within Franschhoek, which was owned by the first woman. We heard that earlier today.
Yeah.
And we tried white wine all the way to red wine.
Right. Yeah.
But I think what's really cool for everyone on the podcast is that we're actually recording on a wine barrel.
Exactly.
So if the sounds are a little bit bassy, it's because of some good wine that we got the microphone sitting on top
exactly.
of.
And then before we go into observability and performance, we told the manager here, we asked, can we just record in here? And if so, we wanted to at least give back a little bit. So folks, if you ever travel to South Africa, ever to the Cape Town region, ever to Franschhoek, stop by at Rickety Bridge, because they allowed us to use their wine cellar to record this episode. Now, Kelvin, I want to say Africa, right, is for many, I think, including me, but especially I think for many of our listeners, a continent and a place that is very unknown.
100%.
Because we are, at least personally, I operate more in Europe, in North America, sometimes Latin America, sometimes APAC, but Africa is really an unknown territory for many. You, in your capacity, working at Mediro, you are working with a lot of clients, not only here in South Africa, but I believe across the continent, correct?
That's correct. So that means we are the sub-Saharan distributor for Dynatrace across Africa. So every part of Africa that doesn't speak French, we're involved into. So the likes of Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, quite a few others. And it's a really interesting dynamic because different parts of Africa has different challenges and different ways that they overcome those challenges, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I didn't tell you this week, we wanted to keep it to this episode. When you opened up the event in Johannesburg, you made some really interesting comment, because you said you're here in South Africa, and South Africa, it's not always easy, right? Because when I arrived here, I was not aware of the whole concept of load shedding, because you have some challenges now here with electricity, where electricity is turned off. So there's a lot of challenges that you have to face. But you always said, as South Africans, you always go forward.
100%.
And I think that was such a nice statement when you opened it. And going forward is also what we saw in many of the presentations and many of the people we visited here. It's amazing how mature your companies are here. We talked with most of the banks, financial institutions, retailers, and when it comes to technology and when it comes to especially the topic that is interesting to both of us, observability, performance, security, a lot of organizations are really mature here, but I always think they are not, because everybody's asking me when I get to a region, how far behind are we behind Europe and the US?
That's so true.
And the thing is, if I look at NetBank, at Investec, at Old Mutual, at all this PicPay, it's Flash, right? These are some of the companies that come to mind because we visited them. It's amazing what they're doing.
It really is, Andy. And I think, exactly what you were saying there with the challenges that we've had. I think South Africa's always had this culture of being resilient. So for many years we had our own national challenges, but South Africans would complain a little bit. I think all people in the world, but even though they complain, they said we can do more. And when we look at our government sector needs a lot of work, but I think all over the world that's usual. But wherever we're lacking in our public sector, the private sector tends to pick it up and say, okay, well, that's a gap that's affecting all South Africans. What can we do to make a difference? And I think that's the way we think is, if there's a problem, there's always opportunity. And we saw this with the likes of Nedbank, the likes of Investec this week. And what is interesting, I mean, we've seen in the sense of maturity in South Africa specifically, going on to topics like DevOps or doing things like platform engineering, a lot of the guys were like, wow, what is this platform engineering? But yet they're doing it without even knowing it. And,
exactly.
And that was quite interesting this week. The guys were like, oh, wow, we're actually learning on the same page. I have to admit, conferences like KubeCon, which I think you're going to be triggering off now in the next week, a lot of these developers and architects do go to those conferences and they take a lot of those learnings back as well. And it was really interesting to see what happened in our events this week, where a lot of the people were like, wow, observability is not just my metrics, it's my logs, it's my business data. And it's going to be interesting to see what the private sector does with that in the next year and how they're going to transform themselves. But one thing that was really interesting in some of the challenges we've seen in our region is, which hyperscalers to choose from in the past year or two. That was a big challenge where the customers were like, do we go Azure, do we go AWS? And they ended up going with both. That was something we saw. Yeah. And then deciding, what do we do for Azure, what do we do for AWS? So one thing that I find interesting in our sector is that almost every customer has both. Yeah. So the diversity of hyperscalers and technologies, the cloud ecosystem, it's really, really vast. And it's just interesting how they're bringing all that data from an observability point of view. That's one thing we've seen quite a bit, especially in the banking sector.
Yeah, and so the true hybrid cloud, also Kubernetes everywhere, as you said, right? I mean, it's amazing to see that adoption here and the technology. Now, another thing that I was really fascinated about, because I've been talking about service level objectives for the last couple of years. Obviously, you've done a great job, here in that region to also advocate for SLOs. And because every customer, every user that presented here was talking about how they're using SLOs to bridge the gap between business and IT to provide a business view on what matters to them. And I thought that was really amazing. Like all the dashboards, every conversation I had was starting with, these are the SLOs. It's amazing.
It really is, and I have to admit that was a challenge for a long time, to be honest, because we'd normally always, coming from Dynatrace at least, we'd always talk to infrastructure teams or monitoring teams, and you'd be boxed into this category of, okay, you do monitoring, which never really had an opportunity to talk to the business. And so as Mediro, we really put a lot of effort into building a team that only focused on functional consulting, which was, hey, you've got tools like Dynatrace as an example. Why is it not being used where the data can be usable for the business? And with that whole journey, we've been able to touch on business individuals to say, well, are you able to make decisions based on your data? And what really became interesting there was that there were two streams where SLOs, for example, became powerful. One was business agreed that if I can measure my outcomes, I want it. So SLOs were being pushed from the business side into technology. Then you had it from the site reliability engineering movements. So before, it was always there, but when it was given a label, site reliability engineering, all of a sudden, now operational people were like, I want SLRs, I want SLAs. And then we started to see that adoption a lot faster. So I think we're going to see a lot more in the next few years as to how those SLOs, as an example, become a lot more entrenched in different parts of the business, which is exciting. Yeah.
Another topic that I thought was really interesting because it got a lot of attention was the topic of security, right? Application security, but going beyond application security. Our colleague Thomas did a great job this week in talking about the different security use cases, and he had like a really great visualization of an onion, where basically at the center of the onion there was like your critical data, and then how the different layers of security make sure to protect this critical data. And then I also saw some of your customers talking about how important security is for them and what they're doing. And for me, what was interesting, we also tried to then figure out what type of data do you need from an observability perspective to actually build up the right protection against any security-related incidents. And I think what we all agreed on while many look at logs for security, which is very important, you cannot cover everything just with logs.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And then we saw, again, Thomas Brandl, he did an awesome job on this, talking about there's use cases around logs, metrics, traces, and user behavior. And if you put all of this together, you can really protect yourself against your precious assets, your critical data being potentially stolen or however impacted. But quickly on the security side, what else do you see? I mean, I don't remember which customer was it. There was one. It was
Old Mutual.
Old Mutual. Thank you so much. Yeah,
100%.
exactly. Old Mutual, right? They talked about how much they've invested in application security and how much money would be involved in case of a security breach. It was amazing numbers and what they have achieved to secure their perimeters. Yeah.
It was amazing. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think 4.6 million or billion was saved in data breaches because of security tools in total. And I mean, having Dynatrace part of that gave them a different dimension to make sure that they prevented these data breaches. When you look at something like a topic of security, I mean, observability, how many times, Andy, for many years, we looked at the data we had. It's like, we know everything about the customer, right? Where they come from, what devices they're using, if their devices are rooted, or they're standard. And we know which load balancers they're going through, the routes, and I'm not going to go into all that detail, but there's so much valuable data that you'd question, why would this not be used for security? So, having a look now at what Dynatrace is doing with security, bringing that type of data and aligning it with potential vulnerabilities or potential attacks, that is, for me, priceless. And, I mean, that's just the starting point we heard about. And, why don't we bring that into the world that security already has with the logs and so forth and so on. But when we started looking at the one slide that, Thomas was talking to us, I know we spoke about an onion, but for me, I thought of like a gum, like a chewing gum. Those balls. Because you chew till you get to the juicy parts in the middle. And that's what the hackers are probably trying to do, is like, that's mine. And, when you bring it all together, you spoke about the move it investigation. And I mean, something like that isn't just a vulnerability. There's so many layers, so many legs that happen that can really damage a customer. And seeing how you can bring logs, bring vulnerabilities, bring user performance data all together to make that investigation simpler, I think that's where the penny dropped for me, was being able to see, well, wow, actually all our data should be considered part of security, right? And I think that's going to be interesting, the journey, not just what we have now, but what we're going to see also in the next few years with converged analytics around security. It's going to be really exciting. Yeah.
Hey, before we wrap it up, because I really want to give people a little bit of sense on what Africa is really all about, because I know we are in South Africa. I think South Africa is probably known the best. If you think about Africa, what people know, at least what I knew about Cape Town, Johannesburg, these are all places. But you are operating, as you said, in more than just South Africa. Can you just give us a quick overview of what other countries you are operating in? And
okay, actually all of them, but I'm going to talk about the ones that come to mind very immediately. Some of the things I've seen. If we look at a country like Angola, for example, very, very beautiful culture of people, really love it. But a country like Angola is still struggling with normal issues that we've faced in the area of monitoring for the past 10 years around infrastructure. So, something like that, when we went in with a solution like Dynatrace, we noticed that, hey, we still need to remember the fundamentals. And I think the biggest lesson I learned there was, we have all these new things about automating software, but the fundamentals are still important. How are my networks? How are my devices? How am I, my normal infrastructure monitoring before you start expanding? One of the biggest things I noticed was, in a country like Angola, is that user experience wasn't important because everyone's focusing on the infrastructure. So people are used to a bad experience for now, but once that infrastructure issue gets resolved, then then they come on our bandwagon of user experience is the next thing that becomes important. However, that's one part. Then you go to a country like Nigeria or Kenya. Kenya has actually got the most development, investments across the globe, more than South Africa right now, in the sense of property. So Kenya's booming. And 2 or 3 years ago, it was normal monitoring, normal user experience, but now they're actually investing in Kubernetes, they're investing in DevOps, and they're actually going at a rapid pace. So I would definitely say keep an eye on what's happening in Kenya. I think we're going to have some interesting solutions coming out of Kenya as well, and ways of doing things. Nigeria, in the banking sector, fraud detection is actually probably some of the best in the world.
Okay.
So we've seen that even in South Africa, we actually get individuals from Nigeria to help us with that. So when we're using Dynatrace for banks, we see some really interesting ways in how they manage fraud, how they manage transactions, and they're actually at a similar maturity as to what we have in South Africa, which I actually didn't know 5 years ago. And that's been really interesting. So different type of challenges, a lot more primitive challenges in parts of Africa. But if you keep your eye on Nigeria and Kenya, they're actually progressing really quickly, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. So folks, look at the map, figure out where these countries are, and it seems that Kenya and Nigeria are booming. And I think I remember this week you told me about that you're bringing in experts from Nigeria because fraud is a big topic there, and obviously they know how to fight fraud. And then taking these experts and bringing it into your country, into your territory or your organization makes a lot of sense, right?
100%.
Really cool. Kelvin, I think it's probably time to get back on the wine train.
I think it's a good
Because
idea.
it's time to go to the next estate. But as I said, folks, if any one of you that listens in ever makes it to South Africa, ever make it to Cape Town and Franschhoek, Rickety Bridge is where we've recorded this. We'll probably take a picture here as well and then post it on the podcast. If you make it here, say thank you to the staff for letting us record in here in the wine cellar. And
100%.
Kelvin, again, thank you so much for being such a great advocate here in that region. You, Mediro, and the rest of the team. It's just great to have somebody like you, not only as a partner, but also as a very close friend.
Thank you, Andy. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for inviting me on your channel. I'm excited to see how everyone gets together and moves forward with performance.
Yeah, perfect. All
Thank
right.
you, Andy.
Bye-bye.